Okay, so in this video we are basically now talking about our very first macroeconomic model. Well, really, in general, economic model. And that economic model would be the production possibilities frontier. Now, the reason why the production possibilities frontier, which is the focus then of this chapter, the reason why it's so important is because what we get out of it is then a discussion of how production occurs, how growth occurs, and why trade is a good thing. And when I say why is trade a good thing, it's this general notion, which hopefully will be evident by the end of this chapter, is that in general economists believe that free trade benefits all. Despite what you hear of people trying to protect their jobs and their industries as a result of free trade trying to kind of encroach upon that, the big idea is that, at least among economists, that we strongly believe that free trade does, in fact, benefit all. And we'll have to talk about why that's the case. And so again, I just out of efficiency purposes here, we'll skip over these notions of like outline. It'd be more useful if this was a lecture over several different days, and this was an in-person class, but I'll just skip this for now. As well as the learning objectives. So we know that growth is important. Economic growth would be a good thing. And the question then is, what do I have to do to get economic growth? One thing that economists believe is that the primary way that you get economic growth, there's a number of ways how you could get economic growth, but the primary way that you do it is through technology. Other ways that you can grow the economy is by getting more population, taking over other countries, all right, and getting those people and their resources. But if you're not doing either of those things, really the only way that you can drive your economy forward is with additional technology. And you've got these kind of examples here. Why do we want to grow? Why should we be employing additional technology? Because what it generally leads to then is that the standard of living becomes better. And what we mean by that is that we have more money to spend. We have more money to spend on things that, on leisure types of things. How do we get that? We get that through investments in education, right? Investments in infrastructure, investments in the development of new technology, right? I mean, more people have a high school education than did the case 50 years ago, or a college education than did 50 years ago. The infrastructure is much more developed, right? That I could go from one end of the island to the other using just the bus, right? Or around the entire island using the bus. But also, I can send like documents, I can send pictures, I can send videos, I can make this class, right? All using technology. And that certainly improves all of our standards of living. But the other way that I get the economy to grow is with international trade. And we're going to see all of these things again with our production possibilities frontier. And if we look at that, if we look at this from one kind of, this is kind of useful because it turns out that we just had the last sugar plantation in Hawaii closed down. Well, does that mean that we're eating less sugar? No, not necessarily. It just turns out that we are growing, that the lands where, anywhere in the world where sugar is being grown is more productive, and we have free trade. And yes, if you lived on Maui and you were a sugar plantation worker, you clearly lost out because of free trade. But all of us benefited. And we see that then, like if we just were sugar instead, that by existing sugar plantations able to grow more sugar per acre, right? And that we could also see that that seeds are more productive, or that that the price of this item, right, in this case corn, but in our Hawaiian example of sugar, is cheaper. All because the workers are becoming more productive, the land is more productive, and there's free trade so that I can get the product from where it is cheaper and not have to limit myself geographically. Every society, as we then think through these things, every society has to think about these three critical questions. What are we going to make? How are we going to make it? Who's going to get it? Now, how we answer this is in large part determined by something that's outside of economics, actually. This now gets into this idea of, do I have a market economy or do I have a command-style socialist economy? How best to understand this? Well, in a free market, like we have here in the United States, all of these decisions are determined by, not by the government, but by you and I making personal decisions, right? Firms get to decide what is going to be produced, right? These firms decide what they're going to produce in a free market situation. So if I wanted to start a business that sold 8-tracks, right, no one would want to buy my 8-tracks. Well, I made the decision as a seller that I wanted to make 8-tracks, but no one bought it. So probably not very many future firms are going to be offering 8-tracks. How am I going to make these goods? Well, again, that's determined by individual firms making decisions. And these firms are going to make the decisions so that they're maximizing their profits, so that they are keeping their costs low. Who's going to get them? Well, in a market economy, who gets something is dictated by who's willing to pay the price. All these decisions, these economic questions, are answered differently in a command-style socialist economy. So again, my research is in Mongolia, a now market economy, but formerly socialist economy. And what that meant is that in this case, the Negdel, or the Mongolian word for basically the socialist collective, determined what was going to be made, how much lamb meat, how much cashmere was going to be made in that country. How they were produced was going to reflect the socialist values of the Soviet Union, the old Soviet Union, but also just of the Mongolian economy, which celebrated the herdsman, or the nomadic raising of animals. Who got them? Well, everyone got a allocation of the resources based on being a Mongolian citizen. Very different responses in these two kinds of economies. And the response is that you actually see almost every economy is largely market-based. And the number of socialist or command-style economies are far and few between. In fact, even politically socialist or communist countries like Vietnam, for instance, are largely market-driven. Same with China, right? It's technically a communist country, but the market still drives a lot of these decisions. And so the transition, or the push, has largely been to move to market kinds of economies. So what we want to start to do now is we want to start to drive this discussion of what is a production possibilities frontier. Well, to make a production possibilities frontier, every economy has these things that exist. It has land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurial abilities. And what they are doing, right, with land would be, well, your physical land. It'd also be the resources under your land. Then I'd look at the number of workers I have, how productive those workers are. Then I would look at the machines, I would look at the buildings, that kind of thing. And then I would look at the way in which the technology or the entrepreneurial ability and in which things are combined. And when I do that, I don't know, let's just pick two goods. I really like calculators. Who doesn't? Tell me a person who doesn't like a calculator. What if I understood an economy that could make both calculators and TVs? And let's just say that this is the quantity of calculators and the quantity of TVs. And then they have a certain amount of land, a certain amount of labor, a certain amount of capital, and a certain amount of entrepreneurship / technology in which to combine it. The question would be is, what if they devoted all of themselves to just making TVs, given these resources? Maybe they would make 1,000 TVs. We don't know, right? I mean, I'm kind of making up this number here, but you get the idea of how this production possibilities frontier, or PPF, is being constructed. Is that I have a certain amount of resources that are being used to make a certain number of TVs. And then we could imagine, what if instead, now again, this is instead, not in addition to, but instead, they used all of these resources to just make calculators. Maybe they would make 20,000 of them. And then the issue becomes, well, what happens when they try to make both of the products? How does that look? Well, we're going to see one possibility would be is that it could be bowed outward like that. And that this is now then the production possibilities frontier. All the possible outcome combinations given the resources that I have available to me. Okay, so let's now talk about, as we start to talk about what this picture looks like here, we need to talk about a few things before we actually get into the picture. Let's talk about efficiency first. Well, I can talk about efficiency in two standpoints. From a production standpoint and from an allocation standpoint. From a production standpoint, it would mean that I'm producing things at the lowest opportunity cost. In terms of the allocative efficiency, I am both productively efficient but basically making things that people want. Not to jump ahead here, but going back to the picture that I made here, and just draw it out here. Let's say that this is my production possibilities frontier or curve. PPC, PPF, I'm using the two terms interchangeably. PP, production possibilities curve, or production possibilities frontier. What I'm saying is that the productive efficiency are all of the points on the frontier. All these points are productively efficient. I am producing the most output given the resources that I have. The slope of the production possibilities frontier is the opportunity cost. What we mean by allocative efficiency is that all of these points might be points that I could have, but there's one point where the people actually want that number of TVs and calculators. And so I could demark that one possible point as well, that people actually might want a mix of TVs and calculators, and that they would end up possibly right here. Okay, so at this point, we're doing a review here. Again, every economy is then asking itself, what is it going to make? How is it going to make it? Who's going to get it? That production process then is how I convert my inputs to my outputs. What are my resources? These are my resources. These are the inputs that I use to make my outputs. And then what we say is that we use this production possibilities frontier model to then talk about how I can be efficient, both in terms of production and in terms of allocation. And that's what leads us to now the formal definition of this. Now, I know I already kind of talked about this, but I was kind of almost too anxious and too excited to talk about it that late. The production possibilities frontier, again, are the ways that I can understand, given my inputs or my resources being that land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship, how I convert that to my outputs. That's what my production possibilities frontier tells me. It tells me all those possible output combinations given the current resources that I have. And then it turns out that we can then understand all of these points here. So let me talk about this, but on the next slide here. So if you want to, you can refer to 15 as I'm talking about 16. Slide 16. Is that what we're saying is that I can be at any of these points inside the frontier. Given my resources, I can actually produce at any of these points, but that all of these points are inefficient. How do I know that they're inefficient? Because given the resources that I have, it would be possible to make 6 backpacks and 3 tablets. But look what I could do. I'm trying to use different colors here. What I'm about to say here is very important, so keep in mind the words I'm saying here. I could get more backpacks without giving up tablets. I could get more backpacks without giving up tablets. Or I could get more tablets without giving up backpacks. I could get more tablets without giving up backpacks. Or I could get more of both. That's how we know that it's inefficient. We know that it's inefficient because I can have, again, more output without giving up inputs. When something is efficient, then an opportunity cost exists. Because look at the difference between this point and this point. Let's just call it points B and point C. To go from B to C, I get more tablets, but I get fewer backpacks. And that's what it means to be efficient. If I were at A, there is no opportunity cost to go from A to B. On some level, there's no opportunity cost because I do not give up any tablets to get more backpacks. To go from A to C, there's also, again, on some level, no opportunity cost because I don't give up backpacks to get tablets. Or to go from A to D, I guess, there's no opportunity cost on some level because I don't give up either product to get more of both. But to go from B to C, there is a real opportunity cost. And we see that as reflected here. That I give up backpacks to get more tablets. That opportunity cost is important then because that is my measure of the slope of the frontier. The slope of the frontier is the opportunity cost. Typically, the production possibilities frontier is bowed outward, meaning that the opportunity costs tend to increase as I make more of the products. And we see that because what happens is that people become less efficient eventually at some point by making too much of the product. And so then those opportunity costs have to rise to reflect that. So typically, not always, but typically, the production possibilities frontier is bowed outwards, where I have quantity of, let's say, output 1 and quantity of output 2. With all these points being productively efficient, one of the points being allocatively efficient, all of these points being inefficient, and I cannot produce outside of the frontier. Production outside of the frontier is impossible because I would not have the resources to produce it. So then what does it mean to grow with this understanding of the production possibilities frontier? To grow then means that I have more resources. And if I have more resources, that's going to mean that I'm going to be able to shift out my frontier, right? Shifting out the frontier now moves out the points of efficient production. And we see that then, again, by having more resources or better technology, which means that everyone then gets to consume more stuff. And you see that right here, right? Bigger workforce or better workforce, more capital, better technology, leading to economic growth. Economic growth looks like a frontier shifting outwards. These are now all of my productively efficient points. Points outside of the frontier are impossible. Points inside the frontier represent inefficiency. How do I get that growth? Well, I get that growth by things like business investment, education, money invested for research and development, the economy having a stable money supply, lower tax rates, and exposure to trade. The cool thing about looking at a country like Mongolia, for instance, is you get to see an economy that was formerly socialist. You get to see economists then go into the country in the early 90s and tell that country to do these things to be able to grow. So the warning here I should tell you is that this works in theory, but not necessarily always in reality. Mongolia did not grow dramatically in the 90s, even despite the fact that they adopted these things. there's reasons why it didn't occur. It's not because these things really are wrong, but we don't have a really good realistic test of whether this is true or not. Okay, I'm going to skip this issue here, only because this is a 6-week class. You know, we've got limitations on time as it is. So why should we? If you're really interested in that, read the book. Now, to review then what we've done thus far, we still need to do one more thing here. To review what we've done thus far then, is that we then created what's called a production possibilities frontier. And what that production possibilities frontier graphed out for us was all the combinations of the products we could produce given the resources that we had. Points on the frontier were efficient, points inside the frontier were inefficient, points outside the frontier are impossible. The slope of that frontier is the opportunity cost, and when I shift out the frontier, that is the way that I represent economic growth as having occurred. Now the last part to this is now understanding how trade exists. And again, I'd said that one of the key things that we want to talk about here is how free trade benefits all. Well, the things that we could do here for this then are that when a country decides to produce something, given the resources that it has either an absolute it can have a absolute advantage in something, but it doesn't necessarily have to in order to be able to produce the good. The key thing here is the comparative advantage in making something. So, absolute advantage. This just means that you can make more of it. For instance, it is incredibly easy to grow citrus fruits in Hawaii. We have an absolute advantage in the growth of citrus fruits. In the growth of pineapples, we have a perfect environment for growing pineapples and citrus fruits. But yet, we don't have, right, even the Dole plantation here on the island of Oahu, that's not the central place for growing pineapples, right? And we just did the discussion of the sugar, right? That we don't grow lots of sugar here in Hawaii. And that's because countries trade according to their comparative advantage. It's not important to just say that you can make more of it. Rather, it's that, can I make it at the lowest opportunity cost? Am I the cheapest location for making it? It turns out that lots of pineapples are grown in Central America countries, right? And they're grown in those countries because not only do they have a environment for that, but that they're also, right, they have cheaper labor, or maybe, right, they have cheaper transportation costs. They have a variety of reasons about why it's actually cheaper to make it in that country, or there are better uses for land in this little island of Hawaii than in perhaps a bigger tropical country, right? Countries trade according to their comparative advantage. So what do we need to do to be able to calculate that comparative advantage? We need to calculate the opportunity cost. And we need to find where a country has the lowest opportunity cost in making something. What does this mean here? Is that it means that then if the country has a comparative advantage in making something and another country has a comparative advantage in making something else, that those two countries can then specialize in what they make well and then trade for the other thing. And this trade is actually a good thing because it means that both countries are able to consume more. Let me set up an example for you of this kind of thing. Let's have Hawaii and Mexico. We're kind of, sort of, more or less on the same latitude. I'm not sure exactly what the exactly could be growing, but let's say that they're growing pineapples, let's say, and quantity of pineapples, and let's say quantity of tourism hotel rooms. I don't know. Obviously, I'm making this to get an intended result. There would be that we could have two production possibility frontiers for these two countries, but that the slope is different for the two. They're similarly shaped, but the slope is different. The slope has to be different because then we're saying that they have different opportunity costs, meaning that they have different comparative advantages. Because then what I'm going to do is calculate the comparative advantage across the two countries and find out that a country is cheaper at making one thing than the other. And then they're going to specialize and produce the other thing. I don't know, let's just make this as a example here. Let's say that this is the trade-off. That the trade-off is 25 tourism hotel rooms for 100 pineapples in the state of Hawaii versus 300 pineapples for 100 tourism hotel rooms. If we reduce this down, I can now see that the opportunity cost in Mexico is that one tourism room requires a sacrifice of 3 pineapples. One tourism hotel in Hawaii requires a sacrifice of 4 pineapples. Who makes tourism hotel rooms the cheapest? Mexico, right? It requires a smaller sacrifice. So then, if that's the case, then Mexico has a comparative advantage in tourism hotel rooms. Because they can make them the cheapest. They have the comparative advantage, so then they're going to specialize in making just hotel rooms. Hawaii is going to specialize in just making pineapples. And then they could switch, they could trade with each other. And that trade then becomes critical because that's how the two countries are able to grow and focus their attention. When we say that free trade benefits all, we are certainly realize that individuals are going to be hurt. Right, again, if you're a sugar grower on Maui, you certainly have been hurt by free trade. So then we have to find some way to compensate those individuals so that they're not too hurt by this fact. Because it turns out that everyone in Hawaii benefits from free trade, except those few individuals that end up growing sugar. And when we bring that forward here then to this whole chapter, that what we then see is this idea then that, again, it's not the absolute advantage. It's not the fact that you can grow more of it or make more of it that means you should produce it. Rather, it's the comparative advantage and whether you have the lowest opportunity costs. That then when countries trade with each other, what this is basically saying when we say voluntary trade is a positive sum game, is that both countries benefit from the free trade. It's not the case that China's taking advantage of the U.S. or vice versa in the way that we trade with each other. We are two grown-up, mature countries that aren't under the dictatorship of each other. We are making our own free decisions of what we're going to do. We are both benefiting from free trade in some way, shape, or form. And there we go. And then that's our summary of this chapter. Okay.